Quem quiser fazer pergunta, é só pedir um dos microfones. Eu tenho aqui já algumas perguntas. Lew, se o Greenspan sabia de todas as consequências de suas políticas, por que você acha que ele fez tudo o que ele fez? Vaidade, fama a qualquer preço, pura maldade?
Well, it's probably all of those things, but I think it's fundamentally that he wanted power. St. Augustine talks about the city of man being dominated all too often by those who themselves are ruled by the dominandi, the libido dominandi, that is the lust for power, the lust to rule over other people. And these, of course, are by and large the people who go into government. Those are the people who are attracted into government. Not everybody, maybe not the postman or whatever, but the people who tend to climb to the top of government have a power lust. There's was a long interview conducted by a man named Medvedev, no relation to the present president of Russia, with Khrushchev when he was in his forced retirement. And from the book that this man wrote about Khrushchev, I was always struck by one particular point. Khrushchev said to him, you know, when you get old, everything pales. Clothes, food, fast cars, dachas, women. He said, you lose interest in everything. He said, but you never lose interest in power. And of course, there are people like that. There are people, most of us are perfectly happy to try to run our own lives, take care of our own families. We don't actually want to run the person next door, the town next door, the province next door, the country next door, the whole world. But of course, there are people like that, and they go to work in government. And so I think that's the basic explanation for Greenspan and pretty much all the rest of them.
Uma outra pergunta. Ayn Rand é a autora mais lida na Suécia e hoje tem um público crescente para suas obras no mundo. O senhor vê a influência dela para o libertarianismo de forma positiva ou negativa?
I think it's a positive thing. I don't think I would say it's entirely positive. Just to take one point that Murray, although he was pro-religious, was an agnostic. But he always felt that Rand's influence towards sort of an evangelical atheism was a problem. He said, for all of human history, in every society at all times, virtually everybody's been religious. So he said for libertarians to take a position towards sort of evangelical atheism would turn off everybody. He said it's not part of libertarianism. Murray was always one of those who, there's a controversy in some circles between what one philosopher calls thick libertarianism and thin libertarianism. Does libertarianism also include all kinds of other things besides the question of liberty? And Murray said no, that libertarianism is a political philosophy that says that liberty is the most important political goal. It's not a religion, it's not an ethic, it's not, you need many other things to supplement libertarianism, as important as libertarianism is. So he thought that Rand in that way was a bad influence. On the other hand, I think her, even though she had some, what I would say are economic fallacies based on her view that economics could not have a subjective value theory. She liked Mises, she loved human action, although her copy of human action is full of denunciations of what Mises is saying. But they were close friends. She admired him, and she did a tremendous amount to promote Austrian economics. But she did feel that that everything should be, that all value theory should be objective. And in fact, she appointed George Reisman to come up with an objective value theory for economics. And of course, there was only Smithianism, Marxism, Ricardianism, and that's what he did. So, there's those sorts of things, but the vast majority of young people, and it is mostly young people, who read Rand, inspired by her and directed towards libertarianism, towards Austrian economics, and towards the cause of freedom, I say absolutely. I mean, I was, and I think that's true of virtually everybody else. So I think she's very much of a plus. There are a few bad things, but as the years pass by, these things become less and less relevant.
Tem uma pergunta aqui. Podia levar o microfone. Ah, você tá com o microfone. Pode falar, Rodrigo.
Tá. Lew, qual a sua opinião em relação do ponto de vista ético ou de resultado, do ponto de vista do Second Best Solution de Chicago, por exemplo, até onde um libertário que deseja mais liberdade individual poderia meter a mão na sujeira chamada governo em prol da liberdade? Ou se a probabilidade maior é dele ser engolido pelo Leviatã, já que o poder corrompe?
Well, I should first admit that I once worked for the government. I've since gone straight. But no, I had the honor to work for Ron Paul. And so I would say that Ron Paul shows that it is possible to work in government for liberty. However, the fact that there's been one guy in the last however many hundreds of years doesn't give me a whole lot of confidence that that's the path. But if you have, the Ron Paul sorts of principles, if you can stand up against the opposition of your colleagues, although he's a wonderfully gregarious man, a great athlete too, which helps. I mean, like a champion swimmer and a champion baseball player, always a much sought-after player on the Republican baseball team. So that all that sort of thing helps him. But as you know, if you follow him, you know that how many times he's the one vote in the House of Representatives against something. And in the beginning, that was thought of as just ridiculous. He was just an embarrassment. But of course, if you see that if a vote is, there are 435 members in the U.S. lower house, in the House of Representatives. So if you see that there's a vote of 400 to 35, it doesn't necessarily pique your interest. But if you see it's 434 to 1, then you think, well, gee, why did that guy? Why did he stand against everybody else? So it helped cause a lot of attention. And then, of course, this presidential campaign, which caused millions of young people in America and in North America and across the world to become interested in the Fed. I mean, I've been interested in central banking for many decades, and I could never get anybody interested in it at all. It was a name on the bill in their pocket, and that was about it. Ron Paul, in that one presidential campaign, got everybody interested, and in a Rothbardian sense, because Ron is very much a Rothbardian figure. His populism, his principled libertarianism, his anti-war position, his anti-Fed position, all Rothbardian. They were very close friends, and Murray a strong influence on Ron. But if you look at how Ron got explained that there's an economic error involving. Murray always said it's important to explain the economic error, as Ron has done over what the central bank does. If you see his most recent book, End the Fed, it's a great description of all that. But he also shows that we're being ripped off, in Rothbard's phrase. And Rothbard always thought it was so important to explain the error and also show these people are stealing from you in whatever aspect of the government we're talking about. So, we have free will, and Ron Paul has certainly shown that it's possible to do that. But again, I think for the vast majority of us, it's probably not a good thing. I mean, it really is very corrupt and corrupting politics. And it's, I think of even Thomas Jefferson, who was a rotten president. He's a great guy before he was president, a great guy after he was president, in terms of what he was saying anyway. And while he was president, he did a lot of bad stuff. So, but as Tom Woods pointed out, we do have the heroic example of Warren G. Harding, who also freed Eugene Debs, who had been, I don't know if that name resonates, but he was a famous American left-wing labor leader who had opposed World War I and had criticized the draft, and for which Woodrow Wilson sent him to federal prison under sedition laws. And in the prison, his health was ruined, and he didn't live much longer. But it was Warren G. Harding's, as a conservative Republican, his first act to free this left-wing labor union guy from prison for a speech crime. He also pulled American troops out of Haiti. He did a lot of other great things. So there can be presidents who are on, who are decent on the when weighed all together, but again, the record's not good. So I mean, I would never recommend anybody going into politics. But if it's fun, if you want to do it, you have a vocation for it. I'll just mention also, Ron Paul's got all the sort of best, this is an odd sounding thing, but sort of all the best aspects of a politician in the sense that he wants to convince people, he wants to teach. When he would have contested congressional elections, and these days he pretty much is a shoe-in every time, but he would wear out, speaking of shoes, 5 or 6 pairs of shoes walking his congressional district. Door after door after door, stop to talk to people, explain, answer questions. He loved doing that. And he knew how to create coalitions. He knew what particular point in the libertarian philosophy to make to the particular person. Try to bring everybody together. As he always says, that freedom brings us together, whereas the state divides us. So if you've got those kinds of qualities, and you've got that kind of that desire, go to it. But again, at least in U.S. history, as far as I can tell, there's only been one guy like that in all of U.S. history. So I myself don't see that as a great thing for the average libertarian. But
na linha do que você mencionou, Lew, sobre o Thomas Jefferson ser um bom cara antes do governo, depois do governo, mas não no governo, há uma pergunta aqui nesse sentido. O problema do Fed e a crise americana não tem mais relação, não teria mais relação com incentivos equivocados, que seriam naturais de um sistema estatal, do que com o caráter do presidente de momento do Fed, de quem esteja lá?
Well, I think that's right. You don't get appointed to these jobs, of course, unless you're willing to be a bad guy, whether you're the Supreme Court or cabinet officers, heads of the Fed, heads of all the federal regulatory departments. They're not appointing, let's put it this way, the Elio Beltraus of the North are not appointed to those jobs. So that's just the way it is. And but I think the incentives are all wrong if, from our standpoint, the people who are ruled for the rulers, if, again, they have power lust. So yeah, it's not that's how they can gain more power over people, by going into the government, by becoming Fed chairman, by doing all these terrible things, by bailing out the banks and Wall Street and creating this vast business cycle and all that. But I think it's so yeah, the incentives are wrong, from our standpoint, but they're not wrong from their standpoint. Robert Higgs, the wonderful Robert Higgs, had an article talking, and he was talking about the state schools in the U.S., the public secondary schools, and saying that everyone always says that they failed. And he said, if you look at literacy rates, if you look at just in general what children are learning, the crushing of independent thought, independent minds, this sort of stupido classes that are taught, the exams that are given, everything getting stupider and stupider year by year. He says, from the parent standpoint, from the student standpoint, that's a failure, but that's not a failure from the state's standpoint. It's exactly what the state wants. They want an easily controlled population. And they set out to. So I don't think you can, I disagree with some of our speakers yesterday, but I don't think you can think of the state as a firm. Because, of course, if a firm is sending guys out with guns to grab your money, it's not a business, right? It's a criminal gang. And as Rothbard always talked about the state as a criminal gang writ large. He said you will understand virtually all of what libertarians believe if you think of the government as a gang of thieves. Then everything follows from that. So the incentives for a gang of thieves are different than for the people who are the producers and live peaceful lives and are productive economically and raise nice families and go to church and live their lives well. So I don't know if it's the incentives are wrong, but whether you can ever have good incentives in the state, I don't know. I'll just mention Ron Paul once introduced a bill, obviously having fun with it, to pay the members of Congress a huge amount of money as a percentage of what they would cut from the federal budget. So let's say they cut $100 billion from the federal budget, they'd all be rich. And they could be even richer if they kind of cut $1 trillion or whatever. So that was, it is possible to conceive of setting up the right incentives, but difficult to see such a thing implemented.
Lu, durante o seminário, nós tivemos uma palestra sobre homeschooling do Kleber Nunes, que corajosamente declarou que não vai cumprir a determinação do Estado por considerar essa determinação imoral. O que você acha da desobediência civil?
Well, first of all, I think what a tremendous hero he is. And it's one of the great things I think about the U.S. We have so many millions of children being homeschooled. It's a great act of secession from the regime. There was just a German family that got political asylum in the U.S. Because they were about to be jailed in Germany for the crime of homeschooling. So it's not only a crime in Brazil, but in Germany and other countries. I believe in civil disobedience. On the other hand, I would very much hesitate to urge civil disobedience on anyone because I think it's such an individual decision. Because, of course, if one is not pro-violence, and I think one ought not to be pro-violence, then you're going to have, you may very well have terrible consequences. So I think that has to be an individual decision. But I think civil disobedience is moral, and I tend to think that sort of a mass peaceful resistance to the regime is the way that we'll actually bring some things about in the future. So I certainly hope that he doesn't have to suffer the results of civil disobedience. I hope he can continue to raise his children and continue to be an example to everybody who knows him. He's a great man.
Qual a sua opinião sobre o modelo de Hayek de free banking, que seria a reserva fracionária sem lastro determinado?
Well, I like start at a little different place. I think Hayek's view of competitive currencies is right now a very interesting one, probably much more likely of success than the gold standard. The gold standard, unfortunately, requires good guys in the government, or at least people who feel it's in their interest to bring about honest money. I know Ron Paul is finding that it's a much easier argument to make that people think that, well, maybe there is something wrong with a monopoly. Why shouldn't American Express or somebody else be able to issue their own currency as long as it's a voluntary thing? Since I'm an anarcho-capitalist, I certainly don't believe in laws against free banking in the sense of government laws. On the other hand, I don't think, I'm just quoting Salerno and Rothbard and Thornton and Woods, I don't think that fractional reserves are a good thing because they're capable of creating the business cycle, among other questions. Hoppe makes the point that it's the equivalent of a used car dealer issuing more titles to cars than he owns. And he goes, and offers them as security to people. So even if people know he's doing that, Hans feels there's something funny about it. And of course, this is the juridical argument against fractional reserve banking is at the heart of Jesus Huerta de Soto's huge and magnificent treatise on money and banking and business cycles, which I highly recommend. And I think a Portuguese translation is underway of that book. So that would it's because it's huge. It's going to take a while, but so I don't think it's good. But on the other hand, if you and a banker want to make an agreement to that event, I don't think it should be illegal, but I think it can have bad effects. Rothbard thought that the way to try to hold these bad effects to a minimum was to encourage private bank run squads. People would sort of watch out for who the banks that were really getting out of hand in terms of fractional reserves and warn the customers, hey, all your money is not in there, you better get it out. This, by the way, is a felony in the U.S. if you do this. Because you can't libel a bank. You can't, in fact, tell the truth about the bank, that indeed the money's not there, it's all been loaned out, and they've just got a small fraction. But it's a very tough problem, but I'm not for outlawing a private free banking contract. But just as in the days before central banks, it's possible for fractional reserve banks to bring on a business cycle. So it's not good.
Tem uma pergunta lá atrás?
Lew, uma pergunta um pouco mais polêmica. Democracia. Vale a pena insistir nesse erro ou devemos advogar a secessão imediata?
Well, I think first of all, I'd recommend everybody read Hans Hermann Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed. Very, very interesting book. And Hans holds that democracy has been the friendliest form of government to the state in the history of mankind. And it's not a coincidence that the biggest, most powerful, richest, most dangerous states, at least on a more than local level, are the democratic states, the somewhat liberal democratic states. That they're the ones that are really able to be the troublemakers. And he's got a great analysis of why democracies are so much worse than monarchies. He's an anarcho-capitalist, of course, Hoppe, but he thinks that monarchy is the least bad form of government. So I hope the monarchist movement in Brazil gets going. Anyway, because the king who wants to pass on the realm to his heirs always seeks to preserve the realm because he sees it in some sense as his private property. That under a democracy, the realm is public property, and the people who are temporary caretakers of public property rip it off. He also traces the most fastest growth of the state in the U.S. with each time the franchise was expanded. And he thinks that, like, one person, one vote system is actually the worst possible thing. So, on the other hand, the trouble is, of course, the state uses these words, perverts these words, and, democratic can also mean sort of local self-government, or it can mean friendly ways of doing things, and non-totalitarian, and democracy as opposed to dictatorship and so forth. But he would argue, and I would certainly agree with him, that that's a false dichotomy. But no matter what form of government, I think secession is always an important thing to talk about. Mises said in Nation, State, and Economy that no people and no part of a people, as a principle of classical liberalism, that no people and no part of a people should be held in a political association that it does not want. And he even says that if such a thing were technologically possible, that's not the phrase he uses, that even individuals should be able to secede. Well, maybe it's technologically possible now, but you can tell the things that outrage the regime, and that you should be talking about some things like the secession. I mean, it threatens them. They're very afraid of it, because of course they want to consolidate. It's always a tendency towards consolidation within nation states and among nation states, and there's more and more of a drive for a world government, a world currency, world central bank, the sort of nightmare that Keynes wished upon us. So I think the actual facts of secession are very important. People ought to be able to secede from the EU rather than being kept in there against their will. People should be able to secede from the U.S. central state, from the Brazilian central state, from any central state, and all the former sort of Jeffersonian principle. Lord Acton called it the one great U.S. contribution to political theory of federalism and decentralism, that by divided sovereignty, by having powerful states as versus a central government, that overall the whole country would be freer, because each would prevent the other from getting out of hand, at least to some extent. Of course, it didn't work in the U.S., right? I mean, eventually they just killed everybody who had a different view. But to talk about it, and Walter Williams just had a wonderful column on secession. I always like to talk about peaceful secession. Professor Williams said peaceful secession or otherwise. So it's very hot, of course. I'm not actually for anything but peaceful secession. But I think it's very important to talk about it, to learn about it, and I think whether, in fact, we talked about, could you have freedom in a nation state as large and consolidated as Brazil or the United States or the EU is becoming? Probably not. I mean, Aristotle thought that anything more than 50,000 was getting out of hand. So I don't know if we have to be that small, but certainly you can't be hundreds of millions ruled by one bunch in a distant government-created capital city, and have that be comport with liberty. I think that's so. The whole idea of secession, talk about secession. It's also not even the idea of breaking. You know, let's say some part of Sao Paulo wanted to break away and be its own city. That's again an important thing, and to be supported. And typically the other people will say, hey, you can't take that. You got to, we got to have your taxes. Well, in fact, the state of Sao Paulo, as I learned, fought for its freedom against the central government in the 1930s. It was tragically defeated, but fought for the old constitution and against being part of the nation state of Brazil. So this tradition goes across the world. As much as they try to suppress it, as much as they try to smear it, the regime and its media. Very important to think about it, write about it, talk about it. Hoppa's written a lot about it. Take a look at some of his articles and speeches. Just go to Mises.org and put secession into the search engine. You'll come up with a whole bunch of stuff. Very, very interesting. So I think it's great to secede, and if at first you don't secede, try again. Yeah.
Lew, você concorda com a posição do Rothbard sobre bombas atômicas, de que elas seriam ilegítimas porque não servem a propósitos defensivos individuais? E como os Estados Unidos deveriam agir no caso do programa nuclear iraniano?
Well, my own position on the atomic bomb is that, and I believe this was Rothbard's position, it's not that it's just an offensive weapon. Obviously, any weapon can be offensive or defensive, right? I mean, a rifle can be a weapon of offense or defense. But the atomic bomb is a specific anti-civilian device, at least when he was talking about it. Now, they've got smaller ones, which they have very unfortunate development too, but the atomic bomb was designed to blow up cities. Well, that's by itself inherently immoral and a war crime. The earlier Geneva Conventions, one of the war crimes was bombing a city from the air with anything, let alone an atomic bomb. So I think whether we look at things from the standpoint of religion or Rothbardian natural rights, I mean, atomic weapons are a real problem. I don't believe that Iran has a nuclear program in the sense that U.S. propaganda is holding it up as. If you remember, it's the exact same stuff we heard about Iraq. Oh, Saddam Hussein's going to get an atomic bomb. He's going to do this and that. It was all, of course, these are just lies for war. I suppose maybe a country has told the truth about a war it wanted to fight at some point. I'm trying to think of an example. I can't think of one, but I don't rule out such a thing as. But I don't think that. I think the U.S. and Israel are aggressors against Iran, certainly continuing to threaten attacks against them, which by itself is a war crime, and very, very unfortunate. If, my guess is Iran does not have an atomic weapon. If they wanted an atomic weapon, one or whatever, why would they want that? To send it to Israel or New York or whatever? They couldn't send it to New York, but in order to be turned into molten glass, the entire country? No, they wanted to prevent the U.S. from being able to attack them. It would be a defensive. I don't think it's a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing that they would have it. I'm not for anybody having atomic weapons, not the U.S., not Israel, not Britain, China, Russia, anybody. But if somebody like Iran wanted one, and lots of other countries, we know in Brazil too there's been talk of this, and the U.S. threatening Brazil not to develop an atomic weapon. Why does Brazil want an atomic weapon in order to bomb Paraguay? Well, maybe over the smuggled cigarettes, right? No, I'm sure not. It would only be because it would be, in effect, as a defensive weapon. Again, I don't think it's a good thing, but when you have a world empire like the U.S. that seeks to be the world government, that seeks to rule every place, has its troops every place, wants its troops more and more places, and wants to be able to be the global authority, and can threaten, as Obama just said, that he's going to have a new nuclear doctrine where he's not going to, he's going to agree the U.S. won't have a first use of nuclear weapons against any non-nuclear power unless he decides that they shouldn't be in that category. So if they're not cooperating with the U.S., then he says that the U.S. can nuke them. It's a war crime. You can't actually, whether we look at St. Augustine or every other theologian or moral thinker has ever looked at this, you can't just bomb women and children and cities and destroy people's entire civilization over some government demand. It's just both crazy and evil. So I think if the U.S. weren't threatening to do things to Iran, if the U.S. in fact weren't committing war crimes against Iran at the very moment by denying free trade with Iran. There are vicious sanctions on Iran. They want to step it up. They want to, for example, deny all gasoline imports. That's the next thing. And the justification is they want to do so much damage to the civilian population that they'll overthrow the government. Well, you're not actually allowed morally to do something evil so that something good allegedly may come of it. You can't, that's sort of not allowed. So I think that U.S. should have nothing to do with Iran, should mind its own business. If I had my way, Obama would bring all the troops home. And Ron Paul always says if you actually want to cut the budget, which of course has to be drastically done, you don't raise taxes, you bring the troops home. Bring all the clothes, all the bases. Saves more than $1 trillion a year right away. So that would be a very good step. I was just going to mention something that Tom Woods said in his speech when he was talking about what an actual, what a fiscal stimulus might be. Ron Paul had a great point. He said he's not for the government having any kind of fiscal stimulus, but if they wanted to have one, he said rather than bail out all the banks for less money than that, they could have given every single American a 1-year reprieve from all federal taxes. He said at least that would allow, he said it's still not a good use of printing press money, but nevertheless, maybe that would have been an actual stimulus. Certainly morally it would have been a good thing to allow people to keep their own incomes for a year, and then maybe they would be unhappy at giving them away again when the year was up. So anyway, I don't believe that Iran is Hitler. I don't believe that Ahmadinejad is Hitler. Of course, he's a crazy Keynesian, so there's much wrong with him. He's done terrible things into the economy of Iran and terrible inflationist and many, many things wrong with him. He's not Hitler. And this whole propaganda campaign that's being ginned up is for conquest. The U.S. wants to control all the oil in the Middle East, not so much that it can get it cheap for American citizens, they couldn't care less about us, but so it can deny it to other countries if it needs to for power reasons. So they can deny China, Russia, Brazil for that matter, any other country. If they're not obeying, then they can be denied.
Vamos para a última pergunta. O que é mais importante para o avanço da liberdade? A difusão da ciência econômica ou a difusão da ideia de direitos naturais?
Well, I guess I would say that spreading economic science is the most important. I don't know whether there actually are natural rights in my own view in the sense that it's normally said. I tend to think with Rothbard that everything is property rights. That extends from your property and yourself and your justly acquired property outside your body, and that you have a right to free speech on your property, and you have a right to free speech on somebody else's property if you've contracted with them or they allow you to have it. But you don't have like a free-floating right to free speech that you can exercise at the mall or in the lobby of this hotel or in your next-door neighbor's front yard. You don't have such a thing. But I think it's important, but sort of the basis in one sense of sound economics is property rights. So I think that the two, I would say the two go together, but I think economics is more important than say, a theory of natural rights. But I don't think they're at all contradictory. And I don't think I think it's possible to be working in all sorts of areas, and some people Right? This is a great diverse movement. Some people work in one, others in other areas. And different people will be appealed to by different approaches. So we need people doing every sort of thing, whether it's in Brazil or every other country, to advance the idea that, if I can put it baldly, that the state is our enemy on earth, that it's the enemy of mankind, the secular enemy of mankind anyway, that it is a parasite, that it starts wars, it kills people, it steals, kidnaps. Of course, it calls it the draft, or it calls it taxes, it calls it war, doesn't call it murder, looting, and kidnapping, and all the rest of the things it does. So I think but on the other hand, if we're talking about from a libertarian standpoint, probably the most important thing, I was like Stephan Kinsella's formulation, that all it takes to be an anarchist is to think that you don't have the right, and no one has the right, to initiate aggression against an innocent person, to initiate force against the innocent, that it's not, or to threaten the initiation of force. If you agree that that's wrong, then you're an anarchist. By the way, that doesn't mean that you think an anarchist society could ever come about. It doesn't mean you know how things would work or any of those kinds of questions. But you just think that the fundamental instrument of government, which is the gun at your head or the knife at your belly or whatever, ordering you to do things. And even though you've done nothing wrong, we're not talking about criminals. Maybe we're talking about public criminals. But anyway, I just say there's room for many, many different approaches. Let 100 flowers bloom. What was Mao Zedong said? Let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let 100 schools of thought contend. So I actually mean it, unlike Mao. But I think certainly within libertarianism, there's room for not only all the old approaches, new ideas. I think it's great to have, David Friedman saying what he says, and there's just let everybody make their best argument for human freedom. It's the most important thing we can do.
Tem mais uma pergunta aqui na plateia.
Oi, boa tarde, Lew. A primeira pergunta é sobre a reforma do sistema financeiro americano, do senador Dodd. Queria saber qual das duas propostas que é mais propícia ao fim do Fed. Se é a proposta republicana de concentrar poder no Fed, ou se é a democrata de criar várias agências e mais burocracia e descentralização de poder mesmo.
Is there a difference? I mean, the Republicans guy was Greenspan. Also, Bernanke's the Republican guy. Maybe the Democrats, if you look back to Paul Volcker, who was the last time that there was an actual cut in the money supply and actually stopped inflation for a time. In one case, the Democrats did better, but I don't really think there's any difference. There's a difference in the interest groups that they service sometimes. There's a difference in the rhetoric they use, but I agree with Butler Schaefer that they're just two wings of the same bird of prey, the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans have better rhetoric in some ways, but if we look at the Bush administration's 8 years, pretty bad, although there's Roger Garrison who says that sooner or later every American president makes you nostalgic for his predecessor. So I'm already missing Bush. I mean, I can't believe I'm saying that. And probably someday I'll miss Obama.